see we just got an extra minute. Hello, gentlemen. Hello, everybody. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity in Industry 4.0. So a pretty basic and obvious topic for, at least for the people on stage with me. Welcome. I'm going to cut to my first question as fast as possible because we don't have much time and there's so many topics to cover. Dave, I'd like to ask you about smart factories. If you could
So yes, smart factories. I figured it's worth very briefly a definition for those. So Industry 4.0, right? We started out with steam power and mechanizing things. We went into mass production and assembly, think Ford. We're now really moving from the era that came next, which is computers and automation, into the concept of cyber-physical, which is really taking that just a level further. And the poor audience had to just endure me a second ago. So the concept in control systems in factories is this idea of operational technology versus information technology. Imagine the two things for a second. On the IT side, you know it's your email, your applications, your ERP, etc. On the OT side, it's where all your robots, your factories, your drug analytics, well, all the things are that are potentially in the manufacturing. And many of these things are actually quite old systems. They're capitalized in a different way. They take a long time to write off. And each of them represents an endpoint, by which I mean a device that can be compromised by bad people. So one of the most critical things, so much of that actually is legacy technology because of the nature of that time frame that they tend to use the technology for. Factories are built for years, not for short-term things like IT these days. So the threats there are as real from anything. The most common vector for people getting through is actually to compromise a user on the business side, steal their credentials, use that to log through, so find an engineer, use that to log into one of the factory devices and start the compromise of the factory device from there. So all of the things that apply to IT cyber really apply to OT. The recommendation is often to segment the network, just to separate them so that you physically are making it impossible for that bridge to happen.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to another topic that we're going to try to cover, Internet of Things. Andrzej, I wanted to ask you, with the growth of IoT devices, M2M connections, the threat from cyber could become physical. Should we be worried, and to what extent should security solutions be automated?
Of course, we should be worried because we had examples of dangers which were, the source of which were interconnected devices, so in Internet of Things. But let me start, as Alan did, with the definition. So Internet of Things, it is the network of interconnected devices, generally physical devices, very often small, like smartwatches, like sensor cameras, home surveillance cameras, or CCTVs. But also cars, vehicles, buildings, intelligent buildings, and so on. The problem with such devices is mainly lays in time to market and the cost of those devices. Very often, such devices like home cameras, they are introduced to the market very quickly with the price as low as possible. So customers are looking for the functionality, so the features, and they are looking for the price. And very often, with the low price comes also low quality in sense of security. Mm-hmm. And the recent example from October last year, when we had a massive DDoS attack, on DNS, which impacted Twitter, Reddit, and many other, Spotify and many other services, and it was the attack from the home cameras. And the reason and the source of the problem was the software in the cameras, which had hard-coded passwords. No one patched the cameras, so it was the device was sold, and that's it. So it is one of the problems we are facing with Internet of Things, that the devices are not constantly maintained, they are not facing patches. And another problem when we talk about the threats is about is about privacy issues. So those devices very often collect information, personal information, but sometimes very sensitive, like heart rates of the person who is carrying the smartwatch, etc. So the question is, are we happy with the situation that somewhere such data are collected and we don't know, even if the device is secure, we are not sure if the cloud where those data are kept is secure.
Okay, thank you very much. Another buzzword and an essential part as well of Industry 4.0, basically digital supply networks and cloud solutions. I wanted to ask Elmar if you think that cloud solutions are secure. If they aren't, then why? And how should we counter threats posed by basically using cloud?
Yeah, so the only real answer on that can be, it depends. Because obviously, a cloud is nothing else than an IT infrastructure, and it has the same weaknesses and the same strengths than other IT infrastructures. Obviously, the IT infrastructures that are maintained by professionals, and most of the cloud providers have other tools and other infrastructure than some companies in their ground, but nevertheless, it is something that needs to be maintained and needs to be really secured. And when I talk to CIOs, sometimes they tell me, well, we now move to the cloud, so we do not have any security problems anymore, because we are not responsible anymore for these data. And that is completely wrong, because the management of a company is responsible for the data security, and you can't give this responsibility away to no cloud provider in the world. Look in your contracts, every cloud provider says, we are not responsible for your data. So vice versa, we also have new laws coming up, so GDPR, for example, 4% of the revenue, of the worldwide revenue of a company if it gets data breached, or 20 million as a penalty. So there are quite some numbers in the room now to know what happens there. So responsibility is on the client side. So how to solve that problem? You made a great task in the talk before, setting the stage for that here, because what you clearly showed is no one can prevent that data gets stolen. So what we think is that if you can't prevent that data gets stolen, you have to encrypt it, because then an attacker is unable to use it. That is the only solution or the only conclusion we come to. Protect your digital assets. Your digital assets are what in the company counts, not everything, but the most important things. And then an attacker steals it, so you don't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Juliusz, I think basically that the gist of what we've been talking about, and basically Industry 4.0 means that many companies will be interconnected. There's going to be a lot of machine-to-machine connections, et cetera, et cetera. So the number of stakeholders that could be attacked is going to grow exponentially. The number of threats is going to grow exponentially. On the other hand, on this stage, we have people who work at companies who understand this threat quite well and are actually, making money off it. The question is, what about the companies that don't understand this, don't understand the threats that this is posing, and especially in an interconnected world, they could endanger not only themselves, but also the other companies that they're working with. Do you think the regulator, the state, should use a carrot and stick approach? Should the state be responsible to make companies more cyber secure? Is this your role?
Yeah, actually, we are good in the predictions. In the last years, we predict that internet will grow. We predict that the Internet of Things will blow up, and now we predict that Industry 4.0 is another step in evolution. So we predict, and usually we can identify the risk, and we can enumerate the risks and threats we're expecting. And in that way of evolution, for sure, we need to care about the cybersecurity, because in cyberspace, this world is expanding. The second world is expanding, and will be more involving people in that life. From my point of view, for sure, it cannot be done without the state. State need to help build the security in the cyberspace. The state needs to prepare something kind of the framework or give the a good ecosystem for building the cybersecurity. But from the different point of view, we cannot expect that the state will do everything alone, okay? It cannot be done by the state, it cannot be done by the single agency in the country. This problem can be solved only in some kind of the cooperation, huge, wide cooperation. So we need to build something kind of the private-public partnership where the cooperation with the government, with the state agencies and private sector will build a strong, good technical cooperation, and working together we can solve the issues we can face off in the next few years. It's not a long distance; it's short distance. In next years, we can face that problems. So from that point of view, most important is building this PPP program, and in National Cybersecurity Center, which is a part of the Academic and Computer Network Research Institute, we're building a big public-private partnership program, and currently we have 55 companies, private sector, and also state agencies, which are most important from the social and economic point of view. So we have 55 agreements, MOUs already signed, and we are still building a huge coalition for building better security in cyberspace.
Okay, but that's a positive approach. That's the carrot. I wanted to ask you about the stick. Excuse the silly analogy, but it's in Poland. It's Children's Day today. Do you think an analogy with mandatory vaccinations would make sense? Do you think the state should make companies have a certain amount of sort of cybersecurity installed, and that this should be mandatory?
States should prepare and create a good ecosystem, and should not to force standards and should not force the regulations. From my point of view, it's better the carrot approach and give the opportunity to invest, opportunity to improve the security standards. That may be a good border is if we can list the standards which are not good and should not be used, but I'm not a fan of situation when we can provide the right standards and say use only these standards. So that the different point of the view
okay.
of cybersecurity.
What about you guys? Is anybody opting for the vaccination scenario?
Absolutely. So the reality is quite a little bit different when it comes to GDPR, for example. There are laws in place that force encryption, for example, from personal related data. There are laws in place that the European or data in the European Union are not allowed to transfer it without special regulations to the states, for example. So there are these laws, and there are penalties about these laws. So I think a lot of companies would like to have more guidance on which tools to use or what exactly this means, because most of the laws reflect on its state-of-the-art security you have to use. But what is state-of-the-art? That can be interpreted in different ways, and who's going to interpret this? So we are really all waiting from the security industry now on GDPR coming in May next year. What will happen then? Are the companies prepared? If you read the papers, definitely not. Attacks are happening. It is getting more worth and more worth. So what is the reaction? And of course, I think we'll see much more laws in the future that really specifically define what are the tools, what are the measurements that should be taken from companies, because companies need help there.
And I mean, if I can just intervene, and the question is how the member states in the European Union, if we are talking about the GDPR, will apply the law in terms of penalties, because it's up to the regulator in the state to apply the penalty. So if we have data breach with 10 million records, personal PII, so the question is if, let's say, Polish state, if Poland will apply penalty with 20 million euros, and if it will be Liechtenstein who will apply 10,000 euros, and then we can have the penalty heavens, like we have with tax heavens. And people will move the responsibilities for, international companies will move the responsibilities of data protection to different countries. Okay, so in Czech Republic, the penalties are lowest, so let's move all the personal data to the cloud, which will be, Czech unit will be responsible for this.
So I think, what could the state do? This is not a problem that can be controlled by the state. It is a collaboration. It has to be.
I'm not representing the state.
No, but it has to be. Just your comment. So, but it has to be. It has to be collaborative. It's it's almost like a community method. So lots of underlying technologies such as encryption or otherwise that secure the transport of information into lots of different places. GDPR as a legislation is kind of interesting. I think in the security industry, we think it's security legislation. It's privacy legislation, right? Actually, only 3 chapters of the 99 have anything to do with cyber, and one of them is only half a page long, and it's a pretty big document, right? But some of the definition that the state, by defining state-of-the-art or by not defining state-of-the-art, has deliberately left the legislation open because technology is moving so fast. The concept of what's going on in cyber these days, the attacks tomorrow will be different than the ones from yesterday. How on earth do you legislate for that? So you have to keep it wide. I think it's interesting seeing different companies' approaches. Some are definitely thinking we could insure our way out of it. We'll wait and see. Will the regulators fine anybody anyway? I think the more material side of it really for most companies now, publicized again recently by some of the global attacks, is reputational risk and damage. I want to have trust in the people that I deal with and I trade with. If I don't feel I can trust you, I'll go and find others. So there's a whole range of things in there. So GDPR, I think, comes at a good time, bearing in mind it's replacing legislation that is, 22 years old. Think about what happened here 22 years ago. If you can find a picture of your computer then, it would fill your chair. So lots changed. So I don't think it can be state. It has to be collaborative. We've actually done a bunch of work setting up something called the Cyber Threat Alliance. It's actually become independent now. And it's fundamentally a collaboration of probably the 12 biggest security suppliers on the planet right now, where we are sharing threat intelligence, all the things that we know. We're working with multiple governments around this and sharing threat intelligence. The purpose being, our model as a company, to say, we founded this, was to say, we don't want to win in the market commercially based on knowing something that you didn't know that could have been prevented, because that doesn't help everybody. What we will do is we'll share everything, and then we'll compete on the basis that we will deploy technology most effectively to stop it. And so that's a really important thing.
So actually, this discussion was limited to the privacy and GDPR actually, but cybersecurity is a more wider problem. And I'm personally more involved in the NIS directive implementation and transformation of this directive into the Polish law. So we should take care about the security in wider aspects, not only private data, but this is of course most important and most touchable for companies, right?
But actually, GDPR is actually the first regulation which is really imposing the very high fines. So
it depends. It depends
in
on
European Union, at least.
Yeah, for example, banking is quite well regulated in the public sector. Our base is in the public sector, so therefore there's a lot of regulations around. So for a bank, losing the banking license is quite a problem. So,
but GDPR is something like penalty for all. So if you don't apply to the law, if you don't comply, you're out of business.
But it's not only about raising an additional tax or something like that. It is really getting the focus on personal related data, and that you are not allowed to do with the data what you want to do. Because in some countries, from some cloud providers, you get that feeling. You see, you don't know what is happening with the data they store, where do they store it, where do they move it, where's my data, can I force that it is deleted, and all of these things, they are going on, and that is exactly a limitation on, for example, cloud to be successful.
David,
just back to the state, I'd like to offer up 2 things the government can do, and some are. One of which is create, GDPR is going to happen certainly in the EU, so one of the things they can do is raise the baseline and have, the UK has their Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus program as an example, which is setting a baseline to say, if you want to be a reputable company and trustworthy, you need to comply with these things. And that's being driven by the National Cybersecurity Centre, the government body. The other thing that government can do, and I think industry can help, is education. Education. I mean, I have a 12-year-old daughter, which has got more tech in more places than I ever used to have. But it's a great example. So education, starting at schools, building these things out. It's skills, because there's a skills shortage in industry, so it's good for economy. And the other thing is, ultimately, as mentioned earlier, one of the biggest threats in most cases for cybersecurity is us.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for a lively discussion. I'd just like to say that I think that the question is, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but if we're really going towards a machine-to-machine world, then I don't think it can only be a question of reputation. I mean, it's going to be a serious threat to the whole ecosystem. So this is a question I'm going to leave you with. We don't have time. I'm sorry to have done this, but basically, scratch my vaccination analogy. I'd say it's a seatbelt. Think of it as a seatbelt, right? I mean, at some point when we start driving real fast, the state says you should wear seatbelts, and then we can discuss whether seatbelts should be mandatory, but that's a whole different conversation. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, and see you again.
Thank you.